Hey folks, back with another video. Let's dive into what stories got my attention this week. Starting with Japan. Now, Japan Coast Guard can now directly fire against foreign vessels aiming to land on the Senkaku Islands. Now, this is due to the fact that there was a change in the interpretation of the laws. Now, this news, of course, sends a strong signal to Beijing, namely to back off from even attempting to do anything in Senkaku Islands. Now, in a separate story, the Communications Ministry has reprimanded 11 officials for ethics violations. Now, amongst them was a Cabinet Public Relations Secretary Makiko Yamada, as well as Prime Minister Suga's son as well. Now, they were punished by pay cuts while others were given warnings. Now, the ministry has determined that Sigo Suga or other members of the Tohokushinsha Film Corporation have on 39 occasions wined and dined 13 people that were suspected. However, I believe there's going to be an investigation. I was not able to find any news as to, but I'm sure there will be investigation, and I will see what happens as a result of this. I don't think we'll see the results necessarily immediately, but some punishments have been already meted, and hopefully this will send a signal to the rest of them to not engage in such behaviors in the future. Now, moving on into our next story is the tit for tat, and of course, I have dubbed this part the China versus the world. Now, after 9 rounds of high level military talks, China and India have withdrawn troops from Pangong Lake area, which was confirmed during the 10th round. On a separate story, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi continues to call for better relations with the US. Now, I am absolutely for peace, and if we can work with towards a better relations, then I am for it. Of course, the German Interior Ministry has asserted that China is intimidating Hong Kong residents in Germany, which of course complicates how the West and China can have a good relations. And of course, the Canadian lawmakers passed a non-binding motion with a 260 to nil vote to declare China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority as quote-unquote genocide. And of course, the Dutch Parliament followed the Canadians by accusing China of their actions in the against certain peoples, including the Uyghurs, as genocide. Now, of course, that's not the old news. It seems that a bipartisan bill in the US Senate is under review to address Beijing's censorship or intimidation of Americans and US companies. Now, Biden administration seems to move towards joining Japan in diversifying its supply chain. It is trying to minimize its dependency on China broadly, and I welcome that. I think that is one step towards building. It's sort of a punishment without really meting out punishment. It can come out as that we need to diversify, and I think it will hurt and it will hit the Beijing regime proportionally more, but where anger could also be directed towards them and their actions. Of course, Wally Adeyemo, the President Biden's nominee for Deputy Treasury Secretary, has promised to take hardline approach on China, asserting to hold Beijing accountable in the international system. While William Burns, the nominee for CIA, has identified China as top adversary. Now, this seems that the US is continuing with its tilt towards Asia policy, making the Middle East less important, and China as the major focus moving forward. Of course, moving on into Hong Kong, the Hong Kong has introducing new laws to require community-level district councils to pledge an oath of allegiance to Hong Kong Constitution. Now, Beijing and Hong Kong authorities have determined to make public institutions loyal to Beijing. Of course, the Hong Kong chief executive Carrie Lam has rejected concerns that dissenting voices were being oppressed, but I would say that actions speak louder than words, and the actions of both Beijing and the Hong Kong's regime towards both their people and the people in these against their members in the parliament are not showing that they are that they will they're not trying to uh, oppress dissenting voices. They are actively oppressing dissenting voices as we speak. And as far as I see, this is a bold-faced lie by Miss Carrie Lam, and she should be ashamed of herself for thinking that we're too, um, thinking that we will just buy this. Anyhow, moving on into the other hot area currently is, which being Myanmar. Now, protests, of course, have continued across the country throughout the week. Now, people also attended the funeral of the first victim, the first death amongst of the protesters, Miss Kaying, and so far it has been reported that 569 people have been detained. Of course, Facebook also deleted the military's main page from their website, and Miss Suki's lawyer um, has asserted that her trial will determine the future. Now, I think the future has, I would say, with 80% certainty, has already been determined. But I guess he's trying to sell hope to the people that there is a chance. So good luck with that. Of course, US has imposed sanctions on two Myanmar's generals, and Malaysia has deported 1,086 Myanmar nationals despite a court ordering them not to do so. Of course, that's not all the news from Myanmar. Bangkok's trilateral meeting took place where Foreign Ministry, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, Myanmar's Foreign Minister Wuna Maung Lewain, and Thai Foreign Minister Don Pramud Vinay met and discussed the regional issues. On a separate issue, the inside Myanmar military supporters have come out and attacked the anti-coup protesters in Yangon using slingshots, iron rods, and knives. Of course, it seems that police have now come out firing rubber bullets at protesters as the protesters continue and the government has been clamping down as hard as they can. And of course, the UN ambassador was fired after addressing the UN asking for international help. Now, this is the Myanmar's UN ambassador who made who gave the three-finger salute after the in his while he asked for international community's help. Now, I would say this. I think the ship has pretty much sailed. If they can turn that ship around, good luck. It's going to be very difficult. Anyhow, moving on into our next story. The Judge Dharmender Rana has granted climate activist Disha Ravi bail on the payment of 100,000 Indian rupees, roughly $1,379, which I think it's somewhat of a excessive amount, but hopefully the Indian judiciary will treat her fairly and do what is just in her case. Of course, India has imposed new restriction on social media, which will be implemented in 3 months. Now, as per this restriction, the social media has to take down any content within 24 hours, and the social media company has to disclose the origin of message if asked by the court or the government. Now, of course, there's 3 months, and I think India might have, how should I put it, seen what happened in Australia, and they're trying to wheel and deal their way with the social media. Of course, separately, it seems that the foreign minister of India and China have agreed to establish hotline while discussing future disengagement of troops. And as I've always said, I would like there to be more diplomacy between China and the rest of the world, but it needs to come through a position of strength. And as long as we do diplomacy with them with the position of strength and a clear message, I think it can be done. I am hopeful. Now, moving on into our next story is in Afghanistan, talks have finally resumed after 1 month of delays. Now, both sides, that is, both the government side and Taliban, will sift through demands from the other sides. Now, this all happened because international community, with the help of Pakistan, have made Taliban come to the table. Now, Biden administration is also trying to seek a deal with Taliban to extend the deadline date, while Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel's cabinet has approved a draft mandate allowing German troops to stay in Afghanistan until January 31st, 2022. Now, I would urge the German government to not do this unilaterally. I would urge them to work both with the Afghan government at least, and also work with Taliban on if they are going to keep the troops, that they should be held there with some kind of consent of those at least governing bodies. Otherwise, this could blow back. High chance. Now, moving on into our next story is, of course, Iran. Now, Iran has continued to insist that the US must lift sanctions before any negotiations actually take place. Of course, Turkish President Recep Erdogan has come out and said that he sees an opportunity for salvaging the US-Iran deal, but he did not specify exactly how or what opportunity he sees. I would wish him luck if he can do this. Of course, the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani himself is also trying to salvage the Iran deal despite pressure from the domestic hardliners. And of course, Biden administration is not making President Hassan Rouhani's work any easier as they continue to call for a stricter agreement with Iran in the future. Personally, I think they should come back to the deal with the understanding that in the future they will modify the deal upon further talks. I think that would be, I would urge them that way. But again, and they can choose whichever way they want as long as they come to some kind of a deal. Anyhow, good luck to both sides in this. Moving on into our next story, the US airstrike in Syria against the Kataib Hezbollah. Now, two Air Force F-15E aircraft launched 7 missiles, resulting in fully destroying 9 facilities and heavily damaging 2 other facilities. Now, it is believed that there were 3 trucks transporting munitions from the facilities. Now, Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has said 22 fighters were killed. Now, Iraq has denied having helped US with developing intelligence, something the US said that Iraq has provided them with intelligence on the targets. Separately, Iran has condemned the US airstrike and also denied any responsibility with respect to the attack on the airbase in Erbil in Iraq. Now, in all of this, this seems to be an, how should I say, somewhat of an escalation in Syria. But if it's a one-off, I could sort of let it slide for Biden because I think they're gonna continue to do airstrikes here and there. But there are some rumors that military may have been involved in this, troops on the ground in particular. But I was not able to confirm it. And when I will be, I will definitely put it in any future story. Anyhow, moving on into our next story, we've got lots of story. This is the Saudi Arabia. Now, President Joe Biden has declassified intelligence assessment over Jamal Khashoggi's murder. Now, the assessment implicates Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia for likely approving the operations to capture or kill Khashoggi in Istanbul, Turkey. Of course, the prince had denied the allegations in the past and continues to do so. My personal gut instinct is that when it comes to political matters, the Saudi establishment is it doesn't do anything outside of what the king tells them. So while the news will say it is likely, I would say it is. I need to see the proof to the contrary based on what my understanding of the Saudi government is. I mean, denying an allegation is easy. I personally, and this is my belief, I don't have full proof. My personal belief is that I do believe that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was involved, if not in planning, then at least in approving such a plan. Anyhow, moving on into our next story is Yemen. Hundreds of fighters were killed in a weeks long Houthi offensive in the gas rich Marib, making it the deadliest clash since 2018. Of course, the UN has urged Houthis to return to negotiations, but the Houthi spokesman Mohammed Abdul Salam tweeted that they would fight until the entire country is liberated. Now, when it comes to Yemen, personally, I think Houthis have not done themselves any favor. They continue to make mistakes, making the war worse. And I would urge the Houthi leadership to come to the table. It is time to end this war. You know, do not um, delay the peace. I would urge all sides to not delay the peace. The country needs it and the region needs it. Anyhow, moving on into our next story. President Recep Erdogan has made overtures towards US to build a win-win relations, as he sees that there are more uh, points on which they can agree than disagree, and use that as a way to build a newer, stronger relations. Good luck on that front. However, the Turkish Defense Ministry, on a separate story, has said that four Greek F-16s have approached the, I believe it's pronounced Chesme, research vessel doing survey in international waters. Now, the Greek Defense Ministry has denied the accusations. Now, there is a dispute between Turkey and Greece over their international uh, waters border between the two, and they have had a series of talks. They've had series of that are that have resumed recently, and hopefully, diplomacy can work out their problems. Of course, we're going to continue with Turkey in a separate story completely. Three Turks were convicted for helping smuggle former Nissan chairman Carlos Hussainn in a musical instrument from Japan to Lebanon via Turkey. Now, amongst those who were convicted, two were two pilots and an executive of MNG Jet, a private Turkish airline, and they were given a 4 years and 2 months sentence. Now, Hussain was charged with underreporting his salary and using company funds for personal purposes in Japan. Now, it is to be noted that Mr. Hussain holds French, Lebanese, and Brazilian citizenship, and because he is in Lebanon, Japan does not have an extradition treaty with Lebanon, and so this story is going to get quite interesting in the future. So I will most likely be keeping an eye on this, and if there's any interesting or good, if there's anything to report on, if there's anything to talk about, I will continue. Of course, this story also shows how international law can function and sometimes does not function properly as well, because there are these loopholes that a lot of people don't know about. Hopefully, this story in the future will show that more international cooperation is definitely a good thing. Anyhow, moving on into our next story. Armenian military has come out siding with the opposition in demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. Now, Prime Minister Pashinyan has accused the generals of attempting a coup against him. Of course, the Armenian president Armen Sarkisyan has blocked dismissing the army chief of staff, something the prime minister had um, already ordered. Of course, there have been protests in the country, but it seems recently thousands of people have rallied, and tens of thousands of people, in fact, rallied on both sides of the political divide, attracting attention from various foreigners, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has urged all sides to show restraint. And of course, Turkey's foreign minister condemned any coup attempt. Now, I agree with both these sentiments that a coup is not going to be any answer and that both sides should show restraint. A coup in the current climate would be an absolute death nail to the future prosperity of the country. Now, moving on into our next story, the Interior Minister of Libya's UN recognized government, Fatih Bashegya, has survived a militant attack on his convoy. Now, an armored vehicle had opened fire on the minister's convoy, resulting in one guard and the minister's convoy being wounded, while one of the assailants was killed and two others arrested. Hopefully, the Libyan government can investigate and gets to the bottom of this, but I'm not very highly confident on the Libyan investigators. Now, moving on into our next story is Tunis. Now, former Tunisian presidential candidate and media mogul Nabil Karoui was released on a bail of 10 million dinars, roughly 3.7 million US dollars. Now, Karoui was arrested twice in August of 2019 on charges of money laundering and tax evasion. He was subsequently released in the month of October of 2019. Mohsen Dali, the spokesperson for the Judicial Finance Division, has said that the investigation is still continuing on Mr. Karoui. On a separate story from Tunisia, Ennahda, the largest political party in Tunisia, has held a large protest which are fueling a crisis between Prime Minister Hisham Mashishi and President Kais Saied over a recent cabinet reshuffle. It seems that Tunisia, despite being what is considered the most successful of the Arab Spring countries, is objectively sliding back into another crisis. And I wish the Tunisian people all the luck, and I wish the Tunisian government some sense uh, and some governance sense as well, as I see that they do not, they are deeply lacking in that. Anyhow, moving on into our next story is the Italy's ambassador who was killed in Congo in an attempted kidnapping targeting a United Nations convoy. Now, Ambassador Luca Attanasio, an Italian embassy official, and a World Food Program driver were the three who were killed. Of course, on the next day, the Italian investigators arrived, and the remains of the Italian ambassador and the officer will be repatriated on Tuesday to Kinshasa before heading to Rome. Of course, the government has blamed the Hutu rebels, while the rebels have denied the allegations. Now, nothing more can be said of this except my condolences to the bereaved family, and hopefully the investigators can quickly find who the perpetrators are, and and get the perpetrators to justice. Moving on into our next story is the Niger's presidential election. Now, seven poll workers died after a car hit a landmine, which, I mean, it is sad to hear. And again, as with the last, my condolences to the bereaved family. However, the ruling party candidate Mohamed Bazoum was declared the winner of Niger's presidential election by winning 55.75% of the vote, while the losing candidate Mahaman Osman has alleged that he won by 50.3% of the vote. And of course, this naturally led to the supporters of the losing candidate protesting and some of it turning into riot. Now, if Mr. Osman believes that he has won that, I would urge him to go through legal means, not use intimidation tactics, not to use riots as a way out. Anyhow, we'll see whether the situation cools down or it heats up. Now, moving on into a little bit to the south in Nigeria. A Nigerian Air Force passenger plane crashed outside Abuja airport. Seven people were killed in the crash, and the plane had reported a technicality before it crashed. And again, my condolences to the bereaved family. Of course, in a separate story, 317 schoolgirls were kidnapped overnight from the government girls' science secondary school in the town of Jangebe. Zamfara State Police has begun a search and rescue operations, and I wish them all the success. A little bit of the good news: it seems that the Kagara school children were released after 10 days. So, some good news from Nigeria. However, these kidnappings, as I've already, it seems to be a bit of a norm in Nigeria, and of course, these kidnappings and of the school children on such a regular basis have called. Basically, everybody's calling on the Nigeria's security state. Everybody's questioning: does the Nigerian government have anything under control, or are they just blindly running the government? And it is a valid question. If so many people just get kidnapped just on a regular basis, it seems the state prime job, it is failing to do its prime job. Let's just say that. Anyhow, moving on into our next story. Amnesty International has revoked Alexei Navalny's quote prisoner of conscience end quote status due to past remarks that qualified as advocacy of hatred. Now, Amnesty still believes Navalny should be freed as he has not committed any crime except criticizing the Russian regime. On a separate note, it seems that President Vladimir Putin has approved legislation increasing fines for anti-government protesters. Now, this is something I'm against. I don't think protesters, whoever the protesters are, should be fined. If the protesters have committed some crimes, then yeah, sure, then they are not protesters anymore. But as long as they protest, they should be free to protest, and under they should not be fined under any circumstance. I would urge the Russian government um, to basically revoke this, whatever the legal means is to, but get rid of this legislation. Anyhow, moving on into our next story, Venezuela has expelled the U.S. ambassador Isabel Pedrosa. Now, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza has said the ambassador had 72 hours to leave and declared her persona non grata. Now, Venezuela has took action after European Union foreign ministers imposed sanctions on 19 Venezuelan officials on human rights violations and undermining democracy. And they have frozen their assets as well as banned the 19 individuals from traveling into the bloc. Now, these kind of actions between the EU and Venezuela is, from my perspective, from my understanding, is rapidly turning into a rogue. Some could say it has already turned into a rogue state, but it is turning to a rogue state, and it is very once there seems to be a point of no return. Once a country goes down this path of becoming a rogue state, it cannot come back out of it easily. And of course, a clear cut example is North Korea. While Venezuela has not reached North Korea level, it is rapidly going in that direction. And when it comes to in diplomacy, it is quite difficult um, sometimes to manage these kinds of directions these countries take. But I wish all these EU diplomats that they can hopefully move Venezuela out of that direction towards a positive direction, let's just say. Anyhow, moving on into our next story, of course, is the a former Syrian Secret Service agent who's identified as Ayad was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison on aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. Now, I believe some time ago, of course, I covered the story where the German courts came out and said that they can prosecute people who have committed crimes in other parts of the world if the said person was inside the country. And so these are the results of those decisions. Of course, separately, it seems a second suspect, a senior ex-Syrian official identified as Anwar, is also on trial, and it's believed the trial will last until October. Now, all in all, I think the German courts have done I think it's a good decision on their part. It is, in some sense, expansionary because they're trying to punish people for crimes they committed in another country. And I think there is it's going to get a it's difficult, while on it, I generally think the German courts are right, but I think there needs to be some kind of a limitation as to what kind of crimes they can prosecute a person for committing if they've done these crimes in another country, because there needs to be some kind of I think there needs to be more debate on specifically the limitations and more understanding. While you know all good things, as the expression goes, the way to hell is paved with good intention. I just hope that we don't pave the way to hell with our good intentions. I want to avoid that. Of course, in a separate story, Germany's federal prosecutor's office has announced the espionage charges, and or and the suspect is alleged to have sent the Bundestag's blueprint to the Russian embassy. Now, the allegation is uh, the Russians reject the allegations, questioning the timing of the announcement of these charges as something fueling, how should I say, a sort of Russophobia. And of course, it comes at a time when the relations between Russia and the West are not at its finest, let's just say the least. Hopefully, as we go forward, Germany's federal prosecutor's office will release more actual meat of the charge rather than just announcement, and then we could once we get a little bit more than just the allegations, a little bit more proof. I think that would be something that would be helpful to make informed decision. Now, moving on into our next story is France, where a Sudanese asylum seeker fatally stabbed an employee at a migrant reception center who subsequently died. Now, the prosecutor Cecile Gensac has said that the assailant was not on a national list of terrorism suspects. But of course, it has come out that the Sudanese asylum seeker had two convictions and jail time for acts of violence in 2017 to 2019. Now, of course, it's these kind of stories that I think it is important to keep an eye on, and and not just keep an eye on, but also um, to find out where the system is going wrong. And this shows that the French system may be too lax when it comes to asylum seeker. I think there will, because I think that if somebody has convictions and is being in jail for acts of violence, then such a person, if not a resident of the country, should immediately be sent to the country where that person is from. Think I think that is something I would urge the French, not just the French, but probably more in the Western countries, to adopt as a standard. But before that, I think it again a good how should we say, a debate is definitely needed, and again some sort of like a limitation on there are certain crimes we will not tolerate. Amongst them is violence. It will not be tolerated, but as long as violence means actual physical violence where the harm can be seen instead of these other kinds of non-violence being turned into violence, that's again we need to, again with the law, that we must be very clear. Again, of course, these kind of stories feed into the narratives of those who are uh, who are critical of the government over their lax immigration policy standard. Anyhow, moving on into our next story is the Australia versus Facebook. Now, both sides have claimed victory after a successful negotiation. Now, Facebook has lifted the ban on the Australian media, certain medias, and Australia is going to offer four amendments to the laws that the lower house, that the House of Representatives recently passed. Now, it gives a 2 month mediation period before the government intervenes, and Facebook will retain a unilateral control over which publishers to make deals with. And I think this isn't the end of, while this may be the end of Australia versus Facebook, I think the social media in general, and as I covered the story just minutes ago, on how social media is being regulated by India, I think more countries are going to come out, try to regulate the social media. And I think it's going to get very interesting in the coming months vis-a-vis social media and how the different governments react to them. Now, moving on into our next story is the world of finance. Now, the Financial Action Task Force has added four countries to the terror finance watch list. Amongst them, Senegal, Morocco, Caymans, and Burkina Faso. On a separate story, the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has told Congress that the Federal Reserve will not raise rates until maximum employment and inflation has been achieved, as per whatever the targets are. Of course, the news uh, went into the Wall Street, where various shares rallied just on the news that the Federal Reserve will not raise rates. Now, of course, not just the US, but the whole world as of yet is just fueled with cheap credit by virtually all central banks that have completely distorted the market, and it requires just a little bit of sense and a little bit of just seeing just just look at the balance sheet of the central banks, and it becomes clear that we are in the midst of a distorted market. Anyhow, moving on into some otherworldly news, the medical oxygen scarcity is hitting Africa and Latin American countries. Now, decision to address the issue only happened last month. Now, this came about due to the fact that four people in Egypt in the month of January and six people in Pakistan in the month of December last year died due to the lack of oxygen. Now, hopefully, since these different countries in Africa, Nigeria in Africa in particular, and Brazil in Latin America in particular, but also various other less populous countries are properly addressing this issue, and hopefully within time the issue will be resolved. And in a total out of the world news, Tianwen 1 spacecraft has entered a temporary parking orbit around Mars and will remain there for 3 months before attempting to land. Now, during that period, it will take pictures, it will assess the best way to land on the red planet. And of course, the final news of the presentation is the NASA, which released a video and the first ever audio clip from Mars that was captured by the Perseverance rover uh, when it landed in Mars. Now, it is a short clip that I saw, but it was nonetheless very interesting, and it was exciting to say the least. Anyhow, I would say that is the end of this video. Or to put it separately in a different way, that's it for this video. Now, if you like the video, then hit that like button and hit that subscribe button for future updates. Write in the comment sections your thoughts, criticism, and anything I might have missed. And I will see you in the next video.